Hello and welcome everybody to the last edition of the NYU Game Center's lecture series for 2020. It's December 3rd, and we are going to be joined in a moment by the last speaker for this semester, Mattie, who has recently joined the faculty of the NYU Game Center as a visiting professor. But first, I have a couple thank yous to say. I want to thank all of our sponsors for the lecture series, without whom none of this would be possible. And the sponsors include Fresh Planet, Take-Two Interactive, Empire State Development, and Parsec. Thank you, sponsors. It falls to me. It's my great honor. Oh, I didn't even introduce myself, did I? I'm Naomi Clark, friend of the faculty of the NYU Game Center. And I get to introduce Mattie tonight, which is an enormous pleasure for me. Mattie has been a friend of mine. I think we just figured out since it's at least 2012. So we're going on like 8 or 9 years now. We've worked together. Mattie was my producer on a card game a while back, but her own history with games goes back much further. I think I first became aware of Mattie's work as a game critic, working on multiple publications going back to websites like the Border House and a long-running blog where she eviscerated a lot of traditional ideas about game design and conventional wisdom in games, and sort of became known for that. She went on to create her own digital and analog games, exploring a lot of different topics, some of them autobiographical. Maybe one of her best-known works is the role-playing game Mattie, in which you play through a day in Mattie's life. As a result of Mattie and some other games, she became known as part of the short-lived queer game scene, as it was dubbed before almost immediately being undubbed that. and But her influence on games has continued ever since. She went on to run and create her own conferences, all the way from conferences like Different Games that used to run at NYU, her own conference Playground, and then on up into sort of pulling strings and acting as the central nervous system for big festivals like Indiecade. So she's a very interesting thinker, a teacher at NYU for many years, bringing politics and power dynamics and critical theory into the classroom and applying it to games. And we're really lucky to have her on board the faculty now. And I'm really excited to see what she's going to talk about tonight, which, as I understand it, connects to one other important fact I know about Mattie, which is that even though I come from a family of professional fortune tellers, I have multiple ancestors who are fortune tellers, I've never met anyone who owns as many tarot decks as Mattie. Mattie has a lot of tarot decks, and I think that may have influenced some of the topics tonight. But I don't know what's in this talk. I'm excited to find out. So, without further ado, I want to turn it over to Mattie. Enjoy the lecture. I'll be back afterwards to have some conversation with Mattie and with all of you about what's been said. All right, take it away, Mattie.
Thank you, Naomi, and for super dragging my conspicuous consumption of tarot decks, which is true. So let me just do the fancy thing of sharing my screen, and we can get going. Cool, awesome. So hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. Past few months has been like a whirlwind for everyone for multiple reasons, but for me, I also joined full-time at the Game Center. And I put this up here because I have yet to enter the Game Center as a full-time faculty physically. So one day I will, and see that space and feeling belonging, but I'm sure all of us are, super into, wanting to get out there. So just want to say hello, and hope that this kind of talk I have talks about the sort of thing I want to bring to the Game Center, and also just the game design overall, when it comes to all the different things that I have done in the past. So let's get going. So first I just want to, there we go. So first I just want to talk about what has been my past. So I have been someone who's really interested in change. And I guess like my sort of like lineage has been as an activist of sorts in games. But like this question of like what it, activism in games is always something that is like it's really difficult for me to describe to a lot of people. Whenever I say, "Oh yeah, I've done activist work in games," a lot of people assume I'm a consumer activist, which is interesting. Um, but for the most part, my work has been around creating change within the games industry and adjacent industries such as games journalism about various political issues that are ongoing. Um, most, prolifically is probably about representation in games of different people, particularly of women, people of color, queer people, and just understanding, like how their depiction in games affects and expresses stuff about culture that we may or may not like, and how that kind of affects people's relationships to games. But also just what does it mean to create games? As Naomi mentioned, I was a part of a kind of like scene of people who helped popularize DIY game making tools, particularly around the marginalized, inviting more people to create games when they felt like they were not people who could create games. And so I feel like that moment in my time in games really created the sort of like impetus in which I stay with games, which is that I do feel like games and play have some sort of like interesting effect, power, way to express and to appropriate that I think is interesting, and I really want more and different people to be using games. But overall, I think there's something quite interesting about the idea of activism in a time of, well, 2020. A lot of activism has been happening here in the US. And I've noticed, and throughout the time that I've been in games, a lot of people ask me, as game designers, how do we help change the world? Like how do we do better? How do we help, contribute to anti-racism or fighting sexism? How do we do things like that? And it's like a quite reoccurring question because, um, games are, usually pitched as being entertainment and for fun. And it's really hard to imagine how can those, that media be used for something along the lines of, social equity and cultural change. Um, but I'm not the first person to be thinking about how games can help change the world. Actually, people have been trying for a very long time. And most notably, has been a lot of games evangelism for the past 20 years in the 21st century, where there has been this idea that games will kind of save the world from its own social ills. Quite famously, the World of Warcraft was used as a metaphor as how gamers can use their skills and their passion for games to be put to good use in social change. However, it didn't quite work out. If anything, valorizing traditional gamer things and gamer attitudes and gamer skills um, might have had a backlash or actually a negative effect. I mean, we have seen a quite, what has been described as a raiding of U.S. politics through white nationalism that use games and games culture to elect the 45th president. So we're not exactly sure that games as they are traditionally imagined actually were going to bring about the social change. And since most people have kind of abandoned that sort of thinking, we have to kind of wonder, okay, well, what's the next step? Like, what is the next step if, like, us as games people are going to do? And I feel like this is a kind of a question of like matching our tools with our issues. So as game designers, we tend to look at everything as a game design problem, as games, like games as we understand them. But when we say things like games or game design, we actually mean like video games, and very specifically entertainment video games. And so the design process is used for creating entertainment, especially commercial entertainment video games, is a kind of product design that has basically no reason to be used for social impact or cultural change work. It's kind of like, because you have a hammer, every problem kind of looks like a nail, but sometimes you need a screwdriver for, or pliers or other things in order to understand these sorts of issues. And so I think that is kind of something that we are realizing right now, is that like games as we know it and the design and development of them are not the tools that we use for cultural change. But it doesn't mean that we have to throw out the entire medium, with the bathwater. We just have to begin, formulating new perspectives and tools. And basically, I've been like looking into like, well, what is the issue when it comes to game design and having such a problem when it comes to solving cultural issues. We actually do have a quite thriving, sector of games that is focused on social change, social impact games, serious games. These are kind of like terms usually used for games that are kind of like not specifically for entertainment, but they do use not only entertainment product design for cultural issues, but they also still privilege technologies for technology's sake. And it's always been an issue in actually all of design. So, outside of games, there's like a larger design world, right? And this, that has to do with all sorts of things that are designed, like industrial design. You have like UX design, interior design, architecture. You have urban planning. You have all these sorts of different designs. And the larger design world actually is, whether it's successful or not at the moment, we don't know, or is to be determined. But they are facing what is understood to be design imperialism or neocolonialism, basically meaning using technology as just a way to further extend imperialist attitudes in other places that are not privileged. And this is an issue that the design world, which tries to be self-conscious and wants to contribute to social change through design, something that they are, a lot of research is going into trying to figure out how to undo these sorts of issues. And because game design, funny enough, is like not really well connected to the design world, it isn't really going through the same process as it is right now. And so right now, what the design world is starting to do is have a sort of like both a participatory turn and a speculative turn, like these two sorts of qualities that are trying to imagine new futures in order to enable cultural change. And that's given their kind of trends towards those sorts of themes and topics. It's like we can now wonder, since we are also, at least apparently, a design field as game design, we should be having one as well. But I actually, as Naomi mentioned, I do have a lot of tarot decks and I use them quite often. And in my regular use of tarot and other, divinatory tools, I got a, inspiration of like, wait a second, like games already do have speculative aspects. It already does think about the future. And that's because from the very beginning, games and divination have been basically indistinct from one another. Very early games and divinatory tools were basically the same thing. So if you ever heard of like a sort of like a history of game design, or sorry, of games from any particular lecture, it always starts with like, first there were like the knuckle bones, right, that were used for dice that eventually evolved into dice, right? But those knuckle bones were used for understanding the will of the gods, as well as thinking about other things that are chance based. In the but the evolution of this sort of history that we kind of create for games begins to sort of marginalize away divinatory aspects of games. So if you hear any sort of history of games, you'll hear like, first there was like the knuckle bones, and then there might have been Mancala, and then chess. Then it kind of like skips to like Monopoly, and then there was like Pong and Mario, and then there was Fortnite, right? Like it kind of like has a very particular like sort of like canon of technological advancement. Is how we tend to look at the canon of games and the evolution of games, of like how we just inevitably got to contemporary video games. But along that line, we discard divination, and actually today we don't see things like, we don't teach things like tarot in game design programs. We don't have that sort of content in our conferences, despite that from the very beginning, games and divination have been almost basically indistinct from one another. And I kind of like to lay the blame on actually the first use of trying to make games for good in some manner. So this is a picture of the first casino that was the Ridotto in Italy, in Venice, way back when. And this is when basically playing any games, for the most part, but particularly with like cards and dice, became illegal except for very particular places. And these very particular places, like the Ridotto, were basically barred to only to everyone except for the rich. And it ties into the sort of like the rich and having a sort of like better morality than the poor. But something that people tend to look over in this sort of like moment in history, when like they tried to kind of like assign games into a sort of like morality place, is how much actually the banning of particularly playing cards had to do with of anti-Romani sentiments, and basically a lot of racism of the Romani people in Europe at the time, and how much fortune telling and card playing was associated with them. So there's actually like a really long line of divination and fortune telling being associated particularly with women of color, and how much that was seen as a denigrated, kind of activity. And throughout time, the only people who basically could do divination, particularly like something like tarot, were affluent white people, particularly white esotericists, in the later centuries. And just for the record, it is actually technically still illegal here in New York City to do divination for money. So right now, like if you were to set up shop somewhere and say, hey, I am doing divination here, you could get fined. The reason why people are kind of able to do it here and keep their shops open is because they're technically, supposed to say that this is a performance only, that is play, funny enough. And only under that guise can divination be used for any sort of financial gain. But all the artifacts of divination, even forecasting, that's something I'll get to in the future of this presentation, are used by affluent white people all the time, and yet is a very particular kind of foretelling the future and play that is considered bad for the moral code of society. And so what I would like to do for the rest of this presentation is thinking about what would a game design look like if divination, and particularly in my mind, I'm thinking of tarot cards, but it can be all divination, if they were considered actually canonical to games, they were like centered or a part of regularly taught like classes and conferences and professional, and seen as a professional thing, as a part of our discipline, in particular because I feel like there's a lot of qualities of divination as a play process that can be used to think about our roadblocks when it comes to social, so either social impact design or designing for cultural change. And I think that it's worthwhile doing and having this sort of imagination, because we just have to admit that the current design paradigm of games is just not working. It hasn't been working, for a very long time when it comes to thinking about discrete social change. And I would like for us to just at least be open-minded about how we can be challenging the canon of games from this one perspective at the very least. So one of the first issues that you run into when it comes to okay, I want to design a game for a social impact reason, I want to do some cultural change work, is what is kind of like the concept of autotelicity or autotelic play. And that basically means that when something is autotelic, it means it's for itself. It's not supposed to be for any reason other than its own manifestation, I guess. And this is sort of part of the construction of games as separate from reality. So, so basically, games are supposed to be removed on some level away from reality in order to facilitate itself without feeling like there's going to be an impact on real life by playing the game. So there's kind of, or that is kind of the common conception of games as we have it. One common sentiment about games that they're an escape, right? That they're kind of a world to escape to that shouldn't have any consequence on real life. And so, or if you've ever played a board game and someone kind of does something maybe someone backstabs you in a board game, you can kind of say oh, it's just a game, right? And this idea of it's just a game is supposed to release people from this idea of oh, this doesn't really have an impact on reality. But you kind of get into a kind of a bit of a conundrum when you think about the idea of social impact game design. How can games be both autotelic, so not affecting life, but also be made to affect life, right? How does one square that away if we are thinking about if games are not supposed to affect life, then really no game can really be used to directly affect life if we understand games that way. And so one of the first things I think that would have to go or be challenged or confronted in this idea of what would be a divinatory understanding of games, especially for social impact, is to trouble this idea that games in play have to be for themselves and only themselves, and are characterized by being separate from reality or from real world consequence. And instead, what I find divination does is actually it leans into life as the thing in which you play with. So whenever you are doing divination, you are looking to play with reality. You're looking to understand how reality works and imagine it in multiple avenues and go through some decision-making processes that happens when you evoke divination, you evoke thinking about the future. And so all divination has a relationship to lived experiences. Divination of something other than reality is kind of, I imagine it can happen, but it's quite uncommon. So I think it's quite interesting how divination really leans into playing with real life in a way that most games do not. And I feel like that would have a way of affecting and creating avenues of linking game design to cultural change. And so divination is kind of a way that of sense making this process of okay, well, one, what is even up for grabs for cultural change? What is even up for grabs when it comes to change, when it comes to what we can play with? And then how do we then generate even more understandings of reality, or even our own like life moves, if one will, because divination often has a sort of a prescriptive or advising aspect to it, in which it enables people to actively want to change life by seeking it, by changing the moves that they decide to make. And yeah, we're actually not, games doesn't have any sort of monopoly over divination as an inspiration for, playing with reality. Actually, we have a long history of performance art that is basically almost 100% inspired by divination and related concepts such as synchronicity. Synchronicity is finding meaning in the coincidence or in the coincidental, maybe even in the random, and allowing that to inform your actual, decision making or your actual experience of life. This is Grapefruit by Yoko Ono. It's a book of instructions of game-like theater is performance instructions. And I thought about, when I was first looking through Grapefruit and I was doing research into performance art and its relationship to chance and divination, is it reminded me a lot of how the original computers were people. Like, the term computer comes from the job role that was usually given to women to code things. And this kind of reminded me of that, like of this sort of like, computing life instructions through play and enacting through performance. And so performance art is actually a really good model. At least, I would say how it's evolved. I would say, like, I think it'd be interesting to look at Yoko Ono as someone who is, maybe a luminaire of the games world, where we don't tend to look or center a lot of artists, especially performance artists, and especially just women at all, as people who have a foundational influence on how games are. But the idea of games being performative is not new at all. We actually, we kind of have assigned that to a more of like either a role playing or a digital performance type thing. But like, we've had people creating games in art worlds for a very long time. And that is not part of our canon. I think is kind of interesting and telling. But yeah, like Happenings in particular by like Alan Capro and Happenings were very deliberately performances, but in specific protocol rules, instructions of living life or elevating the mundane or everyday. They were things that you could do within the fabric of life. And artists played with this all the time. So the idea of reality as a sort of play space is not at all new. And it's kind of a shame that we have been kind of ignoring that for such a long time. And a good lineage of performance art is social practice art. So social practice art is a kind of art that specifically looks to have a demonstrable impact for good. It's kind of like, if we have serious games or social impact games, social practice art is like the art world's version of that, I guess. So it's kind of like the quick way of saying it. So right here, what I'm picturing here is the currency of the Ithaca hour, and basically people, an artist, Paul Glover, put in a alternate economy in Ithaca that was based on time. Now, time-based economies are not specifically like new, like they've happened in the past, like for a very long time ago, but like kind of like a serious implementation of it, where currency was made, and like, an entire like, large portion of people have actually participated in it. It was kind of new, especially when done in an arts context. Now, overall, like if you just even look at these, like this is basically play money. And people were ostensibly doing a very extensive LARP when instead of using, dollar currency that we tend to use, they instead use time. So like they would trade hours of time for the things that they needed. So like these are like in a way already very quite playful and not very far away from the design capabilities of game designers. But that means like that people are already using what is called institutional aesthetics, the creation of institutions, of playful institutions, in order to create cultural change in their own ways. And this is not a unique example. There are many examples of artists who use quite playful tactics to make demonstrable change in the communities in which they live. So again, not particularly new or shocking to maybe the art world, but like I think it's kind of a missed opportunity for us of people who are already fluent in play. And recently I come across this conceptual tool of emancipatory bleed by Janaya Kemper, who was is a LARP ethnographer and also creator, if I'm not mistaken. And it's this idea of emancipatory bleed in particular is about the positive effects or feelings or experiences of a game or play, but in this case, in a LARP, bleeding out or leaking out from the game. So that means like the feelings that you have in a game can leave the game with you. And if it's positive, if it's like emancipatory, then it can give you a feeling of power or of energy, of emancipation, of independence that you usually don't feel. Now, most games are not designed with emancipatory bleed in mind, as in like most games are not looking for you to feel something on the outside of that game because of your experience on the inside of that game. But there's really no reason why not. Like, I feel like if we have these sorts of conceptual tools of like, how do we move particular feelings and concepts and experiences in games to outside of games into which they can be folded into the everyday, then I think we should absolutely take it up on ourselves to make these sorts of experiences, particularly in a time of vulnerability that we are in right now. And we can create a whole bunch of things, customs, protocols. There's so many different things that we can begin, like the way that we relate to one another, any sort of practices that we desire, or artifacts even, that first have meaning in a game, but eventually leak out and bleed out of the game to live with us in reality. Is a very kind of like right place to be thinking of playing. But that sort of like leads us to like, okay, if we're thinking about like designing particular life systems to intentionally affect social change, then we have to start to think like, okay, games are often associated with things like systems or dynamics or and things like that. I think about, a system that I know of is gender. And so does that mean that under this context, gender is a game? And it's kind of an interesting question. This is something that one of the first questions that like got me to thinking about design activism in particular, because it's not infrequent for game developers and designers to talk about games as systems, particularly systems in which we play in and master. And I've always understood things like racism, sexism, etc., as systemic oppressions or systems of oppressions. And so wouldn't there be some sort of, design, game design way of approaching something like sexism? And when I asked this question to a lot of, a range of different games people, because I asked them, like, well, why don't we consider this? Like, why is this not considered a part of our intellectual thought in games? I feel like the main answer I got was like, people are not really interested in discussing that sort of thing. I mean, at the time in which I would ask it, which is maybe like, pre 2014, in pre 2016, people weren't really interested in like thinking about social systems as game designers and game developers. Of course, there are plenty of scholars and plenty of activists who are, but like designers and using design techniques in order to interface with the systems in which we are always living with and encountering and appropriating and submitting to. How do we how do we begin to intentionally appropriate these things from a game design perspective? And it also just kind of implies a high cost of in the ethical considerations of going into this topic of what does it mean to design for social change. You have to start thinking, well, whose change, like whose idea of change, when you change this, how will it affect things? And those are perennial issues in divination. Divination is always in a conversation of ethics, of like one of like how much do you know and how much do you use that to influence your decision making. What does it mean when you choose one path over the other? I think when we start to think about games for social impact design, I think a lot of people tend to hope that we're talking about let's create this like one fun game that's kind of similar to traditional games that has a different wrapping around it, and just kind of hope that like it makes people feel better. But instead, we're actually, I feel like my claim here, particularly when it comes to thinking about divination, is no, let's go deeper. All right, let's go and mess with life itself, and let's see how we can actually change it. Because being 2 or 3 steps removed from life is not going to get you the cultural change in which you desire. And so this brings us to a topic that I cannot possibly do justice within this particular presentation. But I think this is going to show where, what are we talking about when it comes to what we're designing is going to become more and more important and more fraught. So as I said before, entertainment game design is a product design, and it tends to be very form focused. It tends to be very object focused. And the design of things is usually from a technical point of view when it comes to like, here's a thing and the thing does something. Whereas I find that a play is a relational type of thinking and designing, is something in which people intentionally create that is not necessarily centered around objects. So whereas a lot of conventional game design is quite really very artistic in the sense of like I made this object and people can interact with it in the way that they wish. The object implies ways in which to play with it, but and usually most people fall in line with how they play with it based on the game and how it's designed. But like the game designer doesn't really have the holistic aspect of play in the environment, in the context in which games are usually created. Often most games are imagined to be consumed outside of any specific context, such as like who knows like what where any game is being played right now, for what reasons, with how many people, on what technologies. Whereas I find that play is a lot more closer, as a concept of what we're designing to divination. And divination, really the cards, in a tarot reading are incidental. Like the deck is an incident. It's just there to serve another purpose, which is the picking up and creation of meaning, the interaction of multiple people, the change in which it wants to affect. Like the design of the objects themselves are only as far as needed to generate more important relationships. Whereas I find that games are so focused on making sure that the objects are designed in an authorial manner. And I feel like that is usually where people think that like cultural change, like if we're thinking about social impact design, the cultural change is supposed to come from the game. And I really think that social change comes from play, in which games are present but incidental. They are, but other, things in the mix of humans relating to each other and into their own lives. And I think that perspective change is really important. And obviously, I just really can't get into I mean, what I'm saying right now deserves its own lecture, but I'll have to like kind of leave it there for now and hope that the theming of what I'm talking about comes out in the future. And so what I'm thinking about when it comes to this sort of play, what I was just describing, is that like there's a bit of an issue when it comes to designing for social impact. Most social impact design or any sort of game design as we currently understand it is usually about teaching players how to play the game and how to get good at the game. But like it's because games are typically autotelic, everything that you're learning about that game is kind of self-contained to that game. You're just learning about that game. And it's possible that through genre conventions or through series or whatever, that you might get better at other games because you played that one. There might be some incidental changes in your life, like maybe you got like better hand-eye coordination or whatever, people like to say games do very well. But those are incidental and not the point of games. The point of games typically is for training people in the game itself. So games actually have a really hard time imbuing meaning to things. It's really hard for when you think about like, okay, what does this game mean? Or what does this particular part of a game mean? It's actually like a quite difficult to answer that in a conventional sense. And so I think a way that we can do better at first not only creating meaning but interpreting meaning in games and play acts is through looking at a tarot reading as a form. And so I just want to kind of take you through not necessarily the basics of a tarot reading, but I want to kind of illustrate to you all what I mean here. So here's the Eight of Hearts, right? I want you to just take a moment and, without like Googling or whatever, what do you think, what does the Eight of Hearts mean? Like, just what does it mean? And I feel like if you're like most people that I talk to or have asked this to, you probably have one or two answers. One is like, well, it's the number 8 in the suit of hearts, which is like fair. Or you don't quite understand the question. Like, what do you mean what it means, right? Like maybe some people might say like, well, it's like above 7 but below 9. It's a red card. There might be some like description of the card and its function or implied function in card games in general. But like the 8, like if I showed this to you and said like, what does this mean about your life? You probably don't really know. It doesn't really imply its own meaning, on its own. But the Eight of Hearts, from a divinatory perspective, has many meanings. From a cartomancy to other forms of divination. So, so let's say like if we were to instead say, what does the Eight of Hearts mean when it's in a more typical divinatory form? Is this card, the Eight of Cups. So the Eight of Cups and the Eight of Hearts are the same card. They share the same origin as one another. But the Eight of Cups, at least to me, describes something of a wisdom and an emotional experiences through past experiences. And that's because of a knowledge base in which has been building over about seeing this card, particularly with these 8 cups, over centuries. Now, you can easily memorize this one and be like, okay, well, whenever I see this card, I'll just say that. But it's about the evolution of meaning, how meaning is assigned to things, how practitioners of divination and fortune telling have grown to put things here. So like the number 8 means things, and the suit of cups means things, and 8 plus cups mean things. And you could easily do that for the Eight of Hearts. You can, because cartomancy is its own system and has its own meanings. But you're able to actually say, I know what this means, and I can relate it to some aspect of real life. But also what's interesting about divination is how it has evolved. So here's the Eight of Cups again, but this time it was depicted in its most iconic depiction by Pamela Coleman Smith, who is did the Rider-Waite Smith, or the original, the kind of the tarot deck that you think about when you think about tarot decks. And here you have a very different, a very different meaning, right? And this is someone who's walking away, is very somber. There's a visual depiction. But my understanding of that past card of this one, of like wisdom through emotional wisdom through experience, is not necessarily gone. Like actually that meaning can be rolled into this one. But just the visual style of this automatically, especially when you're asked, what does this mean? You have a lot more to hang your hat on when it comes to like, okay, I can tell you something this means. Now, functionally, this is still the same as this and this. You can play this card and this card the same exact way. So kind of like, it makes you wonder like, well, why don't we? Like, what is the reason that we don't use these sorts of cards, use and evolve cards in a way in which they have meaning in particular ways of desiring interpretation. So like, I am a deck collector, and so I have a lot of decks, and you'll soon see some more, but like also like playing cards like these, there's loads of these. Like you can go on a Kickstarter or make playing cards or whatever. There's loads of playing cards that are coming from different kinds of people in different forms. But you'll start to notice that most of them look like this. They don't really look any more different than what you're seeing right here, the kind of traditional, imagery. Maybe the quartz might be a little bit different or fancier. The colors might be a little bit different. But overall, you have this. Whereas in divination, something like tarot, this is the Eight of Cups here from the traditional Smith-Waite deck. And here's another one, the Sasaribito tarot, that has another depiction of the Eight of Cups. Now, the Eight of Cups is still this, and is still this, and is still this, but now through like a legacy of and a tradition of fortune telling, you see a different depiction here, but all of the other meanings have kind of rolled into this card. This kind of shows like the cutting away of past bad experiences might be something that you would read into this card, especially if you think about the cutting of long hair as moving on from a relationship. And there's something about this sort of like rolling into meaning, kind of like this sort of this sort of like archaeology of meaning that happens in divination, because every single time you read and you create a meaning, it rolls and adds to the things that you're looking at, as opposed to, let's say, what are all the different strategies I can do with the Eight of Hearts in any particular game. I mean, technically, you can still do the same with this card. It's still the Eight of Hearts, right? It just has a different depiction, and also it's just geared towards something different. It's geared towards interpretation. It's geared toward you interacting with your life. And of course, tarot decks and divination tools in general are very context specific. So the reading, first requires that you say what it is that you want. Like, what is it about your life that you're looking to talk about? And then the context changes, depending on the other cards that are involved. And so these, like, the tarot reading is like it generates meaning. It actually is all about meaning. It's all about like, okay, what am I going to do after I interpret these cards? It's not only like an intellectual journey of figuring it out, of looking at these images and coming to a conclusion, but it's also deciding what is your follow-up? Like, how is it that you're going to change life? And I feel like that divination does this so fluidly. It does it so naturally. And given just like all of this, like this is all the same thing, right? Like there's like no reason we cannot have at least this sort of change in the contemporary games landscape that we do. And just think about all the times in which we use things like chance in games. Anytime that you have chance or decks or choice of any sort is something which divination can influence, even on just a basic level of meaning generation through interacting with either images or symbols, or different contexts. But the way that this all really comes to life is through ritual. And ritual is a lovely word. I enjoy it. And it's also very special to us in the games world because kind of, all the way back from Homo Ludens, from Daddy Johann Huizinga, saying that ritual and play are formally indistinct from one another. And so, if so, that means the construction of these practices around divination are basically the same thing as us constructing play experiences. So the skill set is there, like the mindset is there. It's just the values in which we are approaching how we value games and life are different from the split between divination and games and play. But the one thing that's really important about ritual as a concept, as opposed to how we normally think about the design of games and systems and such like that, is that ritual specifically has it in its form to change at least yourself, if not your surroundings, aesthetically, behaviorally, formally, experientially. Like if you think about like your morning ritual, if you have one, you might think, I can't, answer a Zoom call until I get at least 2 cups of coffee and a shower. Well, that is you transforming life and manipulating life in a way in which sets up the conditions in which you desire to, interact with life. And that might seem, overly simplistic or mundane, but like at this point, that's kind of the level we have to work at. Like it is the mundane every day in which we need to change. And so I find that when we look at this sort of perspective, we see that play is, especially if we take from the lessons of divination and think about how is it that we use games and the appropriation of games for playful reasons, that play is us like enacting our desired futures. I've partied with a lot of queer theory and queer game scenes, and we always love to talk about queer utopias or gesturing utopias through play, using play as an appropriative force for us to manifest our desired utopian ideals. And I think that play is the way in which we channel these things. Play happens through our bodies. We look at a ritual and we see how it needs to be performed. We enact it, and then through us, a change happens in reality. And I don't know what more powerful and liberating practice there could be outside of play when viewed as agency in dictating our future, or not even dictating, but in trying to wrestle some form of interaction with our future. But of course, there's a whole bunch of different perspectives on futures and interacting with futures. And games are not the only discipline to have been born from divination and then, cast aside. There is a discipline of future studies or futurism, which is an odd name to coin, but it basically, as you can kind of see, it turns divination into sort of like an engineering looking problem. And it's kind of turned into this a sort of a design adjacent practice that tends to be for corporate interests, of like how to identify trends and under like the guise of like innovation strategy and all these other sorts of things. So the thing is that like forecasting, having a creative look at futures and understanding the future as creative acts, those things actually are going on. There are professional predictors going on in many sectors of professional life, but it is still divination that is still illegal, like literally illegal. But someone can sell you a workshop and help you forecast the future. for thousands of dollars, especially if you're a corporate interest. And so it just goes to show how much we have denigrated divination as a playful form of agency out of our culture. And yeah, I can go on forever for that. But like these sorts of like, I mentioned earlier about like the speculative turn of design and how it's been using to make us think about these, social issues. Here is a project called The Future Sausage by Caroline Nebling, and it's about a future in which meats are scarcer and we have to kind of fold in fruits and vegetables into our eating, and using the sausage making process as a way to incorporate different nutritional values. This is a kind of typical kind of speculative design, which is like, let's like design some interesting artifacts in which people can view, usually in a gallery or on the internet. And it's supposed to like evoke particular emotions or ideas. It's supposed to like help with imagining a new possibilities of society. But this is an issue that this field of speculative design, design futurism, etc., runs into, that it stays at the conceptual level, and it usually is critiqued for being and staying at an intellectual exercise. And play and game design, I feel, has a way of embodying these sorts of energies, like creating futures and practicing them through the play experiences. Because overall, I think what play is, especially when we think about it from a divinatory perspective, is that it is practicing speculative every day. It's divination has always been invested in the trial and error of the mundane, right? Like how many people, that I know have asked me about love advice from whenever I do a reading, and it's because it's about prototyping the self ostensibly, and our relationships with other people. It's about imagining another way and then attempting to make it happen. And I think that is a really great strength that our discipline has in this fight of like, what is social impact work? How is it that we can translate critique into action? I feel like this is not about designing things as we're used to, but designing ways of being or ways of attempting to be. And this sort of design is iterative and long-term, potentially infinite, right? It's not like a project that you do in like 2 months and then it's done. It's like a plain design that goes on forever, basically. So now with that, especially with what I'm, just kind of like leaving off there, this is kind of like, the part of the talk where, how much long in where people are, okay, well, what do you want us to do, lady? Like, you're just like telling us all this thing and now we're supposed to change. So what do we do? So like, just kind of like a little bit of a summary and thinking about, okay, so we imagined a sort of divinatory playing design, which is centering our relationship to reality and our agency into influencing it, into both like understanding featuring as a creative act and something in which we can implement through ritualistic practice. And so what we have to do then, understanding that this alternative, genealogy of games through divination is still alternative, it's not reality just yet. We need to understand the challenges that we currently have today into implementing some of these ideas. So first of all, obviously, we always need to interrogate the status quo. We have to understand, like, what is it about design as we understand it right now that is stopping us from implementing these ideals? What is stopping us or holding us back from being able to design play experiences in this way? And I really feel like we just have to have a sit-down conversation as a field of like how it is that game design itself is laden with marginalizing ideas to things like divination. Like, why is it that that tarot is not considered a touchstone in games? Why is that, what sort of forces have made that happen? Why do we continue to allow that marginalization? How does it relate to the marginalization of um, of people of color, of women, of queer people, of people of all sorts of backgrounds that are not usually feeling welcome in this space? How does that all relate to one another? We have to understand how much game design as a field has just been completely focused on supplying game development companies with bodies, and how much that has just been the culture of the field. And yes, some people of privilege get to not do that, and they get to try some other path. But we and we understand like the practical needs of, obviously, training people so they can sustain themselves financially and materially. But we can't continue to pretend that game design hasn't been completely arrested by video game development. And we have to understand the consequences of those decisions. And I feel like we have to understand how the privileging of technology and entertainment development skills, like the skills towards those things, how they tend to subjugate cultural engagement. Why is cultural engagement the side issue or the nice to have, as opposed to the things that are currently seen as more central, such as programming knowledge, or the mastery of 3D technology, or having the latest latest tools for whatever one reason wants to have them. I think it's worth interrogating what of these are blockages to our goals of social equity and cultural change. And just to be very upfront, we have to challenge the industry of itself. The games industry has ridden the wave of games evangelism for at least all of the 21st century, and has not challenged its horrible white nationalist underbelly that it helped cultivate throughout the teens and late aughts that have now come to plague all of games. We can't have the bar of, oh, they can do representation and maybe they'll have nicely modeled black and brown people. Like, that's such the bar for the games industry as a force for change and good is so ridiculously low. That we have to do more to challenge the industry and have it be a part of understanding what is its place in social equity. In particular, we need to at least hope that we can have an industry that can at least treat its laborers with some decency and respect. And if we can't even get that, how can we expect industry overall to treat people who it doesn't employ with decency and respect? So I think there is some responsibility of the industry to cultivate artistic and activist scenes. And I feel like that is something that is a looming question for me all the time, especially as I did my work, is what exactly is the games activism world? Is there one? I'm not really sure. I really don't think there is. It's not supported, especially not through non-commercial means. And this is something that many industries grapple with. So it's not necessarily unique, but for the longest time, if I ever said, oh, I do art and games, people usually ask me, oh, do you do 2D or 3D? And it's being conceived outside of the industrial machinations of game development is really just difficult for anyone to imagine at this current moment. And while there are somewhat non-commercial, there is a non-profit, we do have a non-profit industrial complex in the games world. The idea of people who are actually engaged with cultural change is rather scant. I think a lot of those people have a lot of them are privileged to find academic appointments. Like, I'm a privileged person to be able to have even a visiting academic appointment in order to do the work that I do, since it doesn't really curry capital for any particular organization or company. And so I think that, in order to challenge and get to the thing, to a space in which we have any sort of work around social equity, is that we just have to have a space that is materially generative for these kinds of people. We can't really expect the industry as is to be a healthy place for artists and activists to live. And I know that from personal experience, having attempted it myself. And to wrap this up, what I really am, kind of pouring into all of this is a reimagining of the DIY revolution that I feel like I was a part of, back when I was in 2012, when we wanted to open up game development tools to people who normally couldn't. And now that I've seen that sort of energy co-opted by commercial interests, that now the idea of like everyone can make a game, but for game development companies or for affluent artists or boutique studios, I feel like I really want to revisit the idea of the DIY movement and the accessibility, making more accessible a play designed to change the world, or change our own, at least change our own lives. And in order to highlight and show the work that's been going on, not in public spaces, not in expo floors, not on the Steam store, right? Like I feel like there's so much work that's been doing to push games as a medium, as a place in which social change does happen, that goes unnoticed and it goes unspoken. And so I feel like if we do create this design framework, it is not another guarded professional skill, but rather something that in which we wish to spread to everyone. It is going to be like a play process in which everyone is enacting and also working on with one another. So it's not just one person or the few designing for the many, but the many designing for themselves. And I feel like that is a sort of energy that divination, as is being practiced and celebrated today, would have and bring into playing and designing for social equity and cultural change. And that's it. Thank you very much. I think I can stop this. Sorry.
Yeah. Clap, clap, clap. Cool. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, that was amazing, especially that ending. I'm sort of reminded, I mentioned my Nietzsche at the beginning of this lecture, and remind us, like, so that was originally a game that you made for one person, right?
Yes.
Right, so I know it's
I made it for my best friend.
Right, so it's an ancient history now, but like and this sort of came up in chat, but that idea of actually, we don't have to think about games as products that we're putting out there in the world in order to, be part of the few who are the implementers, the devs, right? And be on that side of the divide and like be throwing it over to the audience. But actually, we could think of games about more of just one way that we are in the world with each other, and that we're making games for our friends. We're making games as a letter in order to send a message to somebody else, and then maybe our collected letters turn into a book one day. But that's not really the full point, right? So there's something really nice about that philosophy. You're sort of just like rotating what we're doing so that it's not instrumentalized as part of this, I don't know, the commercial side of art only. I have so many questions. I don't even really know where to begin. I guess I want to ask you and make sure I'm understanding what you're saying about ritual and the autotelic nature of play correctly, right? So I feel like there's been this idea for a while that it's the magic circle is what separates games from life. But I think you're saying something a little bit different, right? Because when Huizinga talks about the magic circle, he's also talking, pointing out how it's used in ritual and other places, right? It's And those are examples of a magic circle separating life and another space where it's not like those spaces aren't supposed to influence life. What you're saying is that it's the autotelic understanding of games that cuts games off from life, not the magic circle. Is that
Yeah,
right?
actually, I think that the magic circle is a little, I think it's, it was an offhanded comment, that was kind of turned into an entire conceptual framework. And what I find that the magic circle is really interesting is the magic circle, I think, is an underutilized design tool. As in, like, when you do ritual and you actually cast a magic circle, like literally in divinatory practices, you intentionally set your mood because you want to feel something in particular. I feel like the way in which magic circles are considered now is this sort of like, I think it's considered like the mood as like, oh yeah, I'm now playing and therefore I'm separated. But in actuality, at least when it comes from a divinatory and otherwise perspective, you intentionally craft certain magic circles in order to put yourself in very specific headspaces. And is meant to be a part of the play experience in which you will move in and out. And often, at least my experiences in casting magic circles, they're actually a part of the kind of process of like emancipatory bleed. Like it doesn't shut off. Like when you leave the magic circle, you don't necessarily, it leaves with you in a way. And so I feel like in a way there has to be like a reclamation a little bit of the understanding of the magic circle if we are going to really look at it as a ritual from the point of view of ritual.
Right. And so the thing that I'm struggling with, that I'm kind of like, my head is exploding a little bit, is the autotelic stuff, because I'm definitely kind of emotionally attached to that idea that like, oh, games can be beautiful in and of themselves. They don't need to serve any other master, right? They can just be something that we would make even in the like the post capitalist, perfectly supplied future, right? Like we would still make games because they're still pleasurable in and of themselves. And I don't know, I guess it's probably like I'm infected not by Huizinga, but by Bernard Suits, right? This idea of like,
right. Yeah,
they're the perfect good. And so I sort of understand why that's seductive, but I'm wrestling with this idea that that's actually that's actually cutting games off from life, right? That we actually have to maybe pierce that idea. And so do you think it's incompatible to say, look, games are a good in and of themselves? They're sort of like, play is like an autotelic good. Is that incompatible with also saying, well then, and then plus of course it's, they can be good for other things too, right? Like I don't know, like is that not possible for us to have our cake and eat it too in that sense? Or like, what is it that?
Yeah. I guess for me, I think this is going to settle down into like a sort of play versus game. Like, what exactly is autotelic? Is it the game or is it the play?
Right.
And so I think at first people don't really make that sort of distinction. And I think that play tends to be for a reason. I think play is ostensibly or always appropriative. It's to take advantage of things for our own desires. And I think games themselves can be autotelic. Like the games are just like, yo, I'm existing because I'm a thing, right? Like, things just are. But like we as people through play and we give meaning and purpose to the things that we're playing with. And so I think that what people attach themselves to is that like, okay, the game itself, it shouldn't have to be for a particular reason or whatever. And I kind of agree. Like, I think that like, if it helps people move away from this idea of like change coming from games, like as in like a game just kind of like emits change, from itself, then like it's more that like our play relationship with games is kind of the point in what is not autotelic. Like we play for reasons and we play for we don't play just to play, I think we play because we have a lot of other things attached to play. So I guess maybe that would be my compromise. I mean, I'm one to kind of be like, autotelicity, I can just like get rid of it. But like if we needed to compromise, that's how I would do it.
Right. Or maybe it works to say, look, there's a lot of things that are potentially autotelic, right? This is the idea of like, there could be many different, it's the plurality of goods, right? Like it's not just one, it's not only happiness is good or pleasure is good. It's actually our relationships are good, or feeling like meaningful is good. Like all of these things are good, and they're actually intertwined. Like, so one thing we play in part because it's interlaced with these other good things, right? So that
Yeah, I
it doesn't
think
just stand on its own.
Yeah, I think the thing that it comes like I guess when one thing maybe I didn't make very clear, but it is part of the reason why I kind of come at that is that autotelic things being autotelic is part of a larger modernist project in
Mhm.
which like art is thought of itself as a kind of own being in which it kind of affects people with the sublime, right? You kind of find the sublime through this kind of autotelic nature of modernist art. Like that is just kind of like a tradition of transferring beauty from like arts to other to people, right? Or to the people who are privileged enough to understand art, right? And I feel like that is such an integral part to the modernist project of detaching people from the from experience of artists of art. That is why like I'm troubled by the concept more maybe than most people. And so like to me it's a little bit easier for me to kind of like unhinge it completely because of like it's just like attachment to the modernist project, and so much of modernism is something that I'm trying to undo. And when I say like thinking about like the assumptions that we have in contemporary game design comes from modernist traditions. And so I feel like there's a lot of modernist traditions I think we need to kind of like interrogate and rip out in order to kind of understand, a sort of game design that can interact with social issues. And I just feel like that detachment from reality, like that's just like that phrase is just so like, peak modernism, right? And so I think that that's kind of why I come at it.
Yeah, interesting. I want to move into another question. And also, if you are in chat, like definitely put questions for Mattie in chat. We would love to hear your questions. I know a bunch of you have thoughts. I was seeing them come up in chat while Mattie was talking. You should like if you ask them now, then we'll get onto those in a second. But I'll keep asking questions in the meantime. Like I'm curious, do you see any signs that are encouraging, like in the direction of of the sorts of stuff you're talking about, right? Like I'm thinking about, for instance, games like self-care or kind words. They feel like they're a little bit
Mhm.
like trying to enact something into the real world, trying to be effective, right?
Yeah.
Is
Mhm.
that like a positive direction that's emerging from recent years, or is that, or there's something else going on?
So I understand like the desire for a question. I would say one thing I would say is close and actually is not necessarily new are LARP, particularly Nordic LARP and American freeform LARP, and also story games, and in particular of kind of solo games, that I think about in particular kind of the rise of solo games in the story game milieu. Basically, there are games that do in some way interrogate or move with life. I find that because of this idea of like games are usually bounded away from reality, that those games still fall under that. And I find that even most large, especially like the Nordic LARP and American freeform, even though they're very intense, um, the phrase bleed came from an over attention to making sure that those experiences were contained, because of the effects of intense play. And so I think that so I think the thing that's why I kind of bring a lot of this up, like I think a lot of language is already there. I think a lot of experimentation is already there. I think you could probably, there's usually some sort of feelings game at like Indiecade, right? As like really feeling centric, like, oh gosh, this like really hits me. There's always they're cropping up. I think it's more like, do we respect those kinds of experimentations? Do we foster those sorts of experimentations? I think to me it's less about, are there designers and designs doing it? I think always, yes, there's always someone out there doing something. Is like, do we actually have the environment? Do we have a positive environment for those places? I would say that like, these sorts of I think these more experimental fringe LARP types are leaning into a positive environment for those things. But also, yeah, I do think that various artistic scenes around games that do like, yeah, kind words and things like that can also, so maybe the more these sorts of like venues that allow for that sort of distribution to happen, They can, but I don't know. I feel like Kind Words is kind of like it's kind of like a fluke in where it came from. I feel like that game like manifested itself through sheer will in the environment that it is. And I think that what we need is a positive environment where like a game like that would be second nature to make.
Right. We're not quite at the point where that game just makes sense, right? People are like, whoa, well, that was weird. Like, what is that? Right. And yeah, and so it's interesting. It's not hard for me to imagine some of these types of ideas like infecting outwards in, say, in role-playing games, right? That's where it's easy to kind of see it spread, because you do have these solo games like Brave Sparrow or something, right? Like or like Avery Alder's other solo games and things like that, which are all of this sort of like, I'm going to change my life by playing a game. But and then so now you see people putting ideas from, for instance, Nordic Lark into mainstream role-playing games, right? They'll have like a bleed debrief at the end of games that are making $500,000 on Kickstarter, and at the end of the role-playing game, you say like, I am Naomi Clark. I'm no longer my character, and this is one thing I want to take away with me. This is one thing I want to leave behind, or a ritual like that, right? Which I feel like very much in line with what you're saying, and so that seems to be going a little bit more mainstream in role playing games. Like I wouldn't be surprised if in 10 years it's in Dungeons and Dragons, but like. I'm wondering, like, I always struggle with this question because, I like think about role-playing games a lot, but like, is there a barrier, and is it like tech related where it's like the software and productization of technology, does it make it more difficult for these kinds of ideas to leap over the fence into an app or like a Steam download or something like that? And like, what can we do about that, if anything? Like what?
Well, I think first of all, like I think that technology, as we understand it itself, does not have to be a barrier, but we have to understand that the design and development of software has been with very specific interests of understanding of like entertainment and what entertainment is. So like, I mean, let's just like think of like, the OG game banned from like, the App Store, Phone Story from Molly Industria. And you just kind of think of like the politics of and the design of these spaces are inherently against these kind of games. I feel like Steam struggled to be like, okay, well, we need to figure out how to encourage people who are not, from like, the green light phase of Steam, right? Where people tried to put experimental stuff on Steam, but then like the masses made sure to let, experimental work know that it was like not welcome. So I feel like I think that it's the design of those spaces that is of technological spaces that is the issue. And we can actually look at a lot of other technology as like through the lens of games and play in order to also see that it's not unique to games. So think of something like Tinder or OkCupid. Like they're designed for people to interact with one another in particular ways and look at each other in particular ways, and the experiences of them are in different ways. And so it's kind of interesting because you now hear people talk about how like dating and such is horrible, especially on the internet, but that's only because it's very distinctly aligned with ad revenue models. So like there's only like the fact that like the infrastructure of the interests of the people who have designed our spaces are one thing. So yes, it is going to be very difficult for us to put this sort of experimental work on those spaces. But I don't think that technology and internet and things like that are inherently, as concepts, able to be divorced. So while I am very like, it seems like I'm very like much of a Luddite at times, I'm just more of an anti-capitalist, I guess. That's what it is. Like I hate how like all of these spaces have been owned and designed in ways for us to interact only in commercial interest ways, even down to the fact of like how we interact with one another. And I think that is kind of the thing that we need to challenge more than anything else.
Yeah, that makes sense, and we're kind of lucky in a way to have social media as such a stellar example of like, did this really have to be?
Yes.
Did it have to work this way, right? And like, you can kind of imagine that it doesn't have to. But I feel like you're drawing an interesting connection between the games for change model is so predicated on like a certain kind of idea, almost a pre-internet idea of a game as a piece of software that like injects an experience into one person's brain at a time, right? And like that, and a lot of it is still of that games for change industrial model is still stuck in that way of thinking of like game as a delivery mechanism. And yeah, and there's so many other ways of thinking about it, like even looking at games as performed, as they're performed things, right? Because that shifts an emphasis on the play. We can look at all the culture that's generated from sports and like all the different kinds of meanings that arise there, or at role-playing games or any number of other things. All right, I've kind of rattled on enough. I actually want to go to some questions from the audience. We're getting a bunch now. So I'm going to pick some out. If I don't ask your question, you can blame me. Right. So here's one. Do you think that the mechanics of divination can help us externalize our latent cosmological and ideological beliefs in a way that we could codify the complexities of the collective human consciousness to escape the room of civilization collapse? Right? Like, can we?
Is this a troll question? I mean, no. I think that like what it is that. So what's really interesting, I think, I'm going to take some intent from that question. What I think is about like what it is of like the interactive. What I think divination wants to do is sort of like connect us with like the larger, whatever the larger means. And that what was really interesting about that is that whatever is the larger is up to the individual. So that could be nature, it could be the universe, both like undercase U universe and capital U universe. It could be spirits or God. It could be anything. Like what is the all is who knows? Like that's it's really individualistic up to what you're doing. And so if you want to think of it as a formal quality, then you can choose whatever that is. And if you're thinking of like cosmology, which I'm going to just assume as sort of like the way in which things work, the ways in which the world works from a kind of like a theoretical perspective, then you can use it to engage with those sorts of issues and topics. Like I guess that kind of from like my slide of like, is gender a game? Well, I think was something that's quite interesting. When I would read this, I often from my queer studies background, we're playing with gender is like not a radical phrase, right? Like the idea of like gender play has been around since like that discipline has been around. And so like this idea that we are interacting, appropriating, messing with how we understand something like gender, but also race and also ability and all these other things, class, like, voguing is playing with the cosmology of class, so like there's all these interactions with these kind of like vague systems, if one will. It's kind of like the fog of whatever through play. And I think the divinatory interpretive aspects, really help us do that, as opposed to, again, like feel like we have to go to this constructed object to inject us with an awakening of any sort.
So it's interesting. So the idea is that you're connecting with something larger, right? And is the larger, so I feel like the minimum threshold understanding of divination, like how it works if you don't want to invoke any kind of, I don't know, supernatural explanations, which this is a hot topic in my family because, like I said, there's professional fortune tellers and different people in my family have different understanding of it, right? Like, but one of my aunts explained it to me like this, like, well, when you're doing a reading, it's like you connect your brain out to like a deck of cards and like all the meanings that have been accrued there. And then it forms the circuit back into your brain. So it's like a way of you to like look at your own mind and reflect, and interpret like what's going on in your life. And so that's like easy for like a cynical teenager to understand. But the larger that divination is connecting to, do you understand it? Like, when you think about it, are you thinking about like, well, there's this gigantic cloud of meanings that have accrued in the tarot images, for instance, over time? And is that the larger like cosmology?
For me personally, I feel like I have accepted like the idea of chaos, I guess, in the sense of like everything exists, but like the way I myself, like this person with this perspective, can't perceive everything. Like it's impossible to perceive every single thing that is going on. and how everything actually happens. And so as kind of like that example that you just described, like it's not that like I can't imagine it, it's just I can't currently perceive it. And so you have to somehow vault, I have to somehow vault my this perception. I have to kind of get over this perception and get me to a larger understanding that I can still imagine. I just need assistance in imagining it. So I think that idea of like, okay, so I'm going to connect to basically the concept of synchronicity, which was, popularized by Carl Jung, who is a psychoanalyst, is about assigning meaning to randomness ostensibly and how that connects to our collective unconscious and blah, 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 blah. But basically this idea of like finding meaning in chaos, because when you do divination, it is basically randomness, and you're forcing your mind to say, if this randomness is actually meaningful, what is its meaning? And
That's a
that is
pattern
supposed to kind of
recognition.
like vault. Yeah,
Right.
you're trying to vault your logical brain or your current perspective in order to understand like everything. And even the larger could just be yourself. Like you do have a lot going on in the back of your brain that you can't access. And
Sure.
so this is just kind of like, well, what is going on in the back of your brain that you just need to talk about? If that, even if you don't want to go to a larger universal scale of things, just understanding your full perception is also a way of thinking about this as well.
Nice, really interesting. I mean, I love how this connects to some ideas about games too, right? The idea that like they can be a mirror for parts of our consciousness, which is something that like that people like Frank have talked about. Like I think he used Galcon as an example at one point of just like like lots of spaceships shooting at planets as being like it could be a mirror of your brain. Um, okay, let's go to another question. I think this one
Okay.
might be Robert. Hasn't divination also been totally co-opted in the world, though? Like most people would rather subscribe to an organized religion or Disney Plus instead of maintaining a personal relationship to ritual. Like, so I guess like maybe like
Mhm.
has divination been commercialized and taken over?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think what's been really interesting is seeing how trends of secularism in particularly in like younger generations, and then their relationship to commodified versions of spiritual practice. I feel like uh, I saw some sort of like very dystopic headline somewhere about how Soul Cycle is basically a new church for millennials, basically, and it's just like how it has ritualized cycling in a very esoteric manner in order to develop that bond to the all, which is affluent privilege, I guess. But like, I would say yes. I think that, especially even if you just think about how like now Sephora sells tarot decks. I mean, like how people are looking for making meaning in chaotic times is like I feel like it has been commercialized. I feel like it has been, and I think it's interesting that something like Netflix is being brought up because Netflix in its experience design in all experience design or UX design of digital interfaces is heavily trying to mimic ritual, as in to make your reflexes kind of automatically go and move through those spaces towards the things that it wants you to do. And so, yeah, no, I feel like the idea of like, I remember a quote. I think reading a quote that like some exec at Netflix was kind of like, our main competition isn't Hulu, it's sleep. And this idea of kind of like, how do we begin to, yeah, I can't make that up. Like that's what it literally is. It's kind of like, how do we begin to encroach upon these different parts of your lives by ritualizing and reinforcing through particular interfaces and design these things. Those are called dark patterns if anybody wants to look into that sort of design.
Yeah, yeah, really good examples. Yeah, and I guess this is sort of just gets to the bigger question of, well, aren't the people with money just going to overrun this, right? Like I already feel like Fortnite is maybe moving in this direction of creating powerful rituals that like you
Mhm.
know capture the imagination of so many people, right? Moving beyond just gameplay, right?
Right.
And I don't know. I guess we just have to see what happens. Um, they're doing a
Well,
lot
I
better.
mean, I feel like that's what depends on the process, right? I think that's kind of what I brought up at the end of like one thing that I feel like was, I don't know if I want to call it a failing because I didn't really do it on purpose, but like one thing I want to say that did not work out about like the mid-teen decade of the DIY revolution, why I feel like it kind of petered out was because it got co-opted, right? Like it basically got co-opted by commercial interests.
Mm.
And it was because like even though it was a DIY movement and feeling and ethos, not enough of its core centered was counter to the interests of industry. And so I think like it's not enough because like of course like the moment you bring up anything that is like anti-canon, people are kind of like, oh, we have to respect the canon. It's kind of like the first defensive is like, oh, but aren't like video games still okay? It's like, well, yeah, like no one cares, right? But like we do need if we want like that sort of like, if we want something like this to actually persist and not be appropriated by commercial interests, it has to be two things. One, it has to be so offensive to the idea of industry that industry can't possibly co-opt it. And it also has to be constantly evolving. It can't just be like the silver bullet of like, okay, we're just going to do this one tactic. We're just going to give someone game maker and it's going to be good, right? Instead, it has to be a constantly evolving and shared practice. So that's kind of like right at the end, I'm saying like this DIY, this kind of new DIY has to be something that can be done by everyone. And that's not to be like woo woo, is that it's in order to not allow people who are skilled and moneyed to co-opt it. And so that's kind of like my sentiment around that.
Yeah, interesting. It's fascinating to think about the possibilities. Okay, I'm gonna do my duty and get more other people's questions in here. Here we go. The connection between future studies, game design, and divinatory practices is fascinating. Are there any aspects of game design or future studies that the two fields should be paying more attention to? I guess maybe towards each other. Like, what should those two fields be taking from or paying attention to in each other?
I mean, I feel like divination is it. Like that's kind of why I brought this up. Is like this like they both like first of all, both fields denigrate divination in both of their histories.
Hmm.
And the fact that like they have an actual way of entry. So future studies in particular has an issue of basically being glorified workshops for corporate interests. And so of course, like they have a bad rap right now because like, yeah, like when it comes to social change and we're talking about decolonizing design and we're talking about design imperialism and all these other things, like we think about futures and in games as a way to find a common history that allows us to subvert those power structures. And I really think that one thing that tends to be difficult with any social impact work, but particular from like future studies and speculative design, is that it tends to stay conceptual. It tends to stay in the realm of your imagination of like, if we enliven your imagination, you can become futures literate. That's kind of like the phrase of the day, but becoming futures literate, being able to understand the future better. But I feel like play is an embodiment practice. It actually translates concepts into action, and especially through. And so I think the two need each other in that capacity, where games are used to translating concept into practice. So, like, I can hand you a list of rules that could be of any sort. It could be the rules don't even have to be like tic tac toe or anything. It can be any sort of rules, and you will at least attempt to embody them, right? Because you now know the context of like, okay, these are things I'm supposed to follow. Let me just try to translate them from a conceptual, list of rules into practice. But what tends to be the problem with games, that games just don't have good, interesting instructions. Basically, like the instructions are autotelic, right? They're just like they don't work for social impact work. Whereas I find that future studies and speculative design in particular tend to stay in the realm of it's fine to stay in the critique mode, in the like let's conceptualize things and critique things. But then the moment you're like, okay, well, what do we do? Like, where's the praxis? everyone kind of disappears after they get their, their honorarium, right? So like, I feel like this is kind of the way to, to bridge that gap, is to say, okay, well, games, play is already a speculative act, and it is a way of embodying futures. And I think both need each other. And so, yeah, there's a lot of bridge building that has to happen between these disciplines. I should say very quickly that design futurism and stuff does use games, or are beginning to use games as ways to generate futures. And so I would say that like future studies and people who implement future studies have a one up on games. Games are still kind of chilling.
Are they using what, like games where you imagine futures, like Microscope or games like that, or other type?
Yeah, they'll design for themselves. There are some people who are like attempting to do game design for generating features in particular ways. And that might be through card games. So like, very often it's like kind of a mod of, some popular game like Apple to Apples or whatever, right? But like usually geared towards like a practice, usually in a workshop of some sort of like, okay, we're gonna try and generate some features together. Let's use some games to help us do that. And that's the thing, like games world build on their own. Like we world build, we imagine people, we think about scenarios, but they're all just for autotelic reasons.
Right. I that makes sense. So they're kind of using them as just like brainstorming exercises in some ways. So wait, I want to ask you one specific scenario that's happened recently that might be sort of near this juncture. And it's this weird thing that started happening with the 2020 election, the presidential election that happened, where everyone was cast into such a moment of like grave uncertainty, which we're obviously not totally out of yet by any means, but they're like, oh my gosh, we can't imagine what will happen if there's a coup, if the election is contested, if it's taken to the Congress. So all of these organizations started doing these simulation games, right? And infamously, the New Yorker ran one where Jeffrey Toobin exposed himself on Zoom, right? Like that.
Yes.
And that was during one of these games. And so this is sort of an example of like they're trying to forecast, or they're trying to divine the future by basically doing something that's kind of like a role-playing game, or more, maybe a little bit more like a Model UN kind of thing, right? Like it is, and those sorts of things have been kind of around for a while, but it feels like they haven't evolved that much. And like, is that an area that's like worth pushing forward in more?
Absolutely. So a lot of my research is in creating pathways to and from design research and game design. So, one thing that I'm kind of becoming more and more convinced is how much game design is not a design field as in presently. The good news is that it is definitely an art field. So, that's good. But I'm not quite sure it is a design field. And so I've been looking into design research, understanding like what is going on in design research, and all these other things. And that's what I've been doing. So a lot of this research that I'm coming to everyone here with is what is it from the field of design research that we can begin taking, because they're starting to take from games. Now, the thing that they tend to do is that they tend to only take like surface level. So they will take from Mary Flanagan and Eric Zimmerman and Tracy Fullerton, and obviously everyone, they're great, but like it's like one of those things where like they only have like a surface level reading on those things. They don't have like, let's say, a game studies perspective, or they don't have a game designer perspective. Instead, it's kind of like level, like kind of surface level research. And I think that a deeper connection could be made when it comes to like, well, what are the radical aspects of games thinking? Like what is games thinking that is actually already interested in cultural change, in future the creation of futures, and all these sorts of things. And I feel like if we did see some more, interpollination between those two things, something really interesting. And that's kind of what I'm really interested in. I'm interested in creating methodologies that allow us to take from all these fields in order to do what we need to do. Because I think that play is a way to strategize around a lot of the issues that social design is currently facing.
Right. Yeah. Interesting. So yeah. So there are possibilities there. Maybe they're just not in the hands of the right combination of people just yet. Okay. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. I'm going to cherry pick
Oh
a
gosh.
couple questions. Apologies to people whose questions we don't get to. Here's one that I think is I was sort of touching on earlier, right? Like games that are not just single player games, right? That accrue more culture around them. This question says, it seems like very gamey games accrue a lot of meaning over time, like sports or long-running MMOs. Why are these kinds of games able to escape the containedness that you're ascribing to traditional games, right? Like they do get all of these layers of meaning, like tarot cards do.
I would say that that they actually don't really escape because the games are not designed for those communities. Like the games, like the communities that come around them are incidental or because of people who are playing, but it's not necessarily community building games or games for particular purposes. And so I feel like any game that really becomes popular enough gets a culture around it. I mean, look at fan art. Like fan art is like a legacy of showing how culture is created around any work of art, basically. And so I feel like there's a difference to me personally between games that are just interesting enough to get people to create culture about the game and games that change culture. Now, of course, obviously, we notice that there is some linkage there. So there is a lot more bleed. It's kind of like the idea of like in certain cities when the local football team loses, domestic abuse goes up. So we know that those like sort of like cultural factors happen, right? So we know real life and games actually do have a relationship, but the intentionality between those things and the way that can sports actually like itself through the game, can it deal with its domestic abuse issue? I don't know. I don't think so. So like, I feel like the difference between like, what does it mean to play and have a play process that actually engages with culture, and then games that just happen to have culture around them, I feel like there is something distinct there.
Right. Yeah. And as somebody who has designed a large community game with hundreds of thousands of players, like I have to admit that you're kind of right. Like the designers of the games, like that, it's a fantasy that like we somehow created this culture, right? It's more like it's stuck to our game somehow because we held it up in the wind.
Yeah, they chose you. Yeah. Yeah.
And then we kind of pretend like, oh, we're managing this thing. Yeah, we're in charge still. Let's
Yeah.
patch the game.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
so it's interesting, and I don't know. Like, I keep thinking about Fortnite in this context for some reason because obviously the Epic is trying to like ride that elephant in some way, right? And making tons of money off of it. But what is the culture that's being created? It's a weird hybrid of a bunch of different things mashing up, right? Their alliances with musicians and weird other brands and all sorts of stuff. I think
Yeah.
Austin Walker just said that he thinks Fortnite is more like plastic than like Hasbro. So he thinks it's more like an industrial polymer. It's like an entertainment or toy company. So we'll see if that.
Okay, I can get with that.
All right, our last question. Let's go to this one. Is there a risk that when we're identifying mainstream games work as being autotelic, like if we say like, okay, big AAA game is autotelic, would that, if we think about games that way, are we going to turn a blind eye to the ones that are political, activist, or polemical games, but they have conservative political goals, right? Like, like a Tom Clancy game or like a traditional fantasy RPG and their positions on race and labor. Like, I guess maybe they're pretending to be autotelic, right? Like, oh, this takes place in a totally different world, but they're not really. They're like reactionary. Is like, so what do you think? Is that
I would
actually
say that
bleeding over into the world?
I mean, I would say that autotelicity, if one will, serves a purpose. I mean, it serves a purpose of pretending things are not attached, right?
Right.
So the reason that you feel comfortable murdering 500 people in a row is because, hey, like it does not have effect on life. However, obviously, you are enjoying and participating and absorbing something, right? Something is obviously happening, or else we wouldn't make games, right? Like if we didn't feel anything, if we didn't think anything from games,
I,
then we
I was
wouldn't
just
do we
stressed
would do
out.
that. Now there's
Okay, I need to
yeah,
release my.
exactly. I need some like stress relief after a hard day of work, right? But like it does still have a function, but like the autotelicity of games serves particular purposes. And I think one thing in particular that is worth understanding is that those sorts of games in particular train people in the game itself and its own logics and in absorbing how to be good and to interpret those games. And so, like, when you absorb all those things, you are also in some way identifying with it. You're also kind of beginning to integrate all of those cultural messages, those actions, those reflexes into yourself in some way. So it's not to say that, like, just because a game is autotelic means it doesn't affect anything. It's just how these games position themselves as not affecting reality, when in actuality they do, but only in very particular ways through the games. If you begin to understand, how games do influence, it gets into scary territory, right? That's when everyone's like, no, games don't cause violence, right? And that's kind of like the first thing that everyone says. Like the moment you want to say, well, what effect does games have? You're only allowed to say that you have better hand-eye coordination, but no violence, we promise, right? Like that's kind of like, that's still the conversation. If you bring up how do games actually shift people, but we know they shift attitudes all the time. So one very popular, but very prolific example is the game Spent. It was this game about trying to model being homeless, and it was made by like an ad agency to kind of show like you make people go through a sort of simulation of being homeless and show how hard it is. But because they basically made poverty into actually a winnable system, as in like you can figure out how to get out of poverty. It actually, when people did exit surveys and analyses of attitudes towards the impoverished, that game actually gave people worse attitudes towards people who are impoverished because they were able through the game to figure out how to escape poverty, right? So
Yes,
like it doesn't even have to, it doesn't even have to do with like, oh no, let's worry about like games with conservative ideals. No, we have to worry about these games that actually have, like nice ideas of like, yeah, poverty is hard, but like when you design it in a way that is through an entertainment product design, which foregrounds that sort of interaction, you're going to get these sorts of results.
right. So we're sort of saying you're seeing two things. So one, like the autotelicity is a little bit of a, like maybe what some sociologists would call like a pretense or like a sense of pretense, right?
Right.
We're just saying, well, we're going to act like it has nothing to do with the real world. That way you can enjoy it, right? Even though
Yes.
that's not necessarily the case. And then also because there is this self-referential autotelicity of the system where you're being trained in itself, that like can just overwhelm any kind of intended message too, right?
Exactly.
It's like, we intend you to understand poor people. Actually, now you think that you'd be really good at being poor because the game
Exactly.
the game. Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah, I don't know. I feel like it's really this has all been really thought provoking. I feel like we're cracking a bunch of interesting eggs open. And yeah, maybe we'll just continue to think and have these conversations with each other and everybody in chat. And yeah, the very last thought, somebody asked a question about like, how does this all relate to Blazeball? And I've been thinking about that too. I don't know if you've been following Blazeball
Really?
at all, Mattie.
No, I inform me.
Well, so I think Blazeball is an interesting example because it has a lot of ritual. It's a big sort of weird community game. It's not really commercial, really. It kind of is.
Okay.
And it's a sort of cult phenomenon, but among of like, it's a kind of a hipster game, I have to say. Sorry, Blazeball.
Okay, hipster.
There's a huge gulf between Blazeball and Fortnite. But Blazeball, like I think it's not really palatable to the big commercial sense because it's like it's basically just fantasy baseball, but it's surreal and it has lots of spins in it, and it's like weirdly nerdy at the same time. So I don't know. I feel like there's some sort of aesthetic, like spit up going on, like where if something tried to swallow Blaze Ball, it would get coughed back out. So it might be a good example of like how to coat your play experience with things that will make the recuperation apparatus of cultural capital.
I think overall, like my plea is, I think we just have to think things up from the ground up. Like I think the way that we consider developing or designing games just has to be rethought from the core. So yeah, I feel like while of course there are some examples of varying qualities of this happening all over the place, like I feel like not a day goes a time goes by that someone's like doesn't like try to email me and ask me like, how do I as X change things? And it's hard, like the idea of like, what does it mean to intentionally change things through your craft is difficult. It's like not an easy question. And this is like not really an answer either. I think like what I've laid out is more like, here is a possible entry point into critiquing and building past contemporary game design. If anything, this is just like, we need more game designs is basically the core kernel of this. Like we just can't use entertainment product design for social impact work. That's it. That's a claim. I think everyone's wrong who disagrees, basically. So like I think that like we have to then do the work in, well, what is that? Like what is this alternative that we use if we are actually committed to saying, I as a game designer through my craft wants to impact the world through design activism. And I think that if we actually are we have to walk the talk is kind of where I'm getting. We can't say, sorry, like I don't think, World of Warcraft has mobilized all of us into better people, unfortunately. And so what it is, we have to pick up the slack in like all that evangelism that we've been doing about how great games are, so like let's like figure that out.
Nice. I think that's a good place to leave it right there. Thank you everybody for coming tonight. Thank you so much, Mattie, for a wonderful talk and for answering questions and diving into
and if other people didn't get to ask me questions, just email me at mattie@nyu.edu and I'll answer them.
Yeah, I know there was one question we didn't get to about like recommendations for tarot decks, so you might have to like post those.
Oh, really? Yeah. Okay. I can do that. That's fine.
Yeah, and big thanks to Mirabai Knight of Cinematic Cart Services for doing such amazing transcribing work and doing all the captioning. Excellent as usual. And thanks to our sponsors, to Fresh Planet, to Empire State Development, to Parsec, and to Take Two Interactive. For making this lecture series possible. And thanks again, chat. Thank you all for being here. All right.
Thank you.